something like 70 to 75% of the world's population lives in countries with high or very high restrictions on religious freedom. This is according to studies by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. They include such huge percentages of the world's population because it includes countries like China, India, Indonesia, and a lot of places that have very large populations. But there are a whole range of issues. The studies that determined what put countries on that list involve a variety of factors, both different types of government restrictions, different types of social hostilities, and all of those things need to be worked on. There are significant issues. I would say one of the most significant Supreme Court cases in our country in the last 30 or 40 years was the Hosanna Tabor case a couple of years ago that deals with specifically with the ministerial exception to anti-discrimination laws, but more generally with the issue of religious autonomy, which I think is really crucial for religious organizations. There are a lot of countries around the world that continue to have problems with registration of churches, that make it very difficult for religious organizations to register and operate. So there are just a whole range of problems. There's a lot going on because of the increasing recognition of the importance of this work. I think part of what's going on is that, particularly among academics, the assumption was for years that the secularization thesis is the basic description of the pattern of history, that religion is in the course of withering away, and we don't need to take long-term cognizance of this issue because it's ultimately not going to be there. But, you know, great sociologists like Peter Berger have just sort of recanted and said the evidence isn't there. It's not happening. It may be happening in Europe, but that Europe is the exception, not the representative. And the reality is, you know, something like 80% of people on Earth indicate that they are affiliated with some religion or other. It obviously has different levels of importance in people's lives, but it's a huge factor globally, and you can't run a rational foreign policy or a rational policy of any kind if you pretend that factor isn't at play. So Canada has recently adopted a similar system. The UK, their Foreign Commonwealth Office is developing similar priorities. Sweden has similar priorities and pushed on this issue when they were chair of the EU. There's a lot more concern as countries guide their foreign policy that the factor of religious freedom ought to be taken into account. And this is partially because there's a lot of empirical evidence now that is really going to foster all kinds of other goals that countries, that the great democracies have in fostering their own foreign policy. It contributes to peace, it contributes to economic well-being, it helps with poverty problems, it contributes to development. So we're witnessing something I think is very healthy, to see a number of other countries also taking strong interest in this field. One way you can proceed is thinking about countries of particular concern around the world. That is the way the U.S. government talks about them, and that the countries of particular concern are countries that have particularly harsh records of egregious religious freedom violations. This includes countries like China, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. Then there's a cluster of countries that the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom thinks ought to be on the CPC list, but aren't. Vietnam is just off that list, but close. So there are a big set of issues that have to do with things like that. That's right. I mean, I think one of the issues will often be, this would undoubtedly be true of China as well, if you're worried about civil society generating alternative sources of legitimacy and potential opposition to the regime, then you may end up having tighter rules on government security, and it will be done in the name of security, but what it really does is reinforce the autocracy of the regime.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the reasons why U.S. government in general is very supportive of civil society initiatives in general and religious freedom, because there is a very strong correlation between high protection of religious freedom and democratization. Well, as a practical matter, one of the things that they're worried about is they have Somalia on their border, and they've got they're worried about Somali terrorists coming into the country. So this means that they're worried about security issues ever since before, but particularly
Mm-hmm.
since 9/11, there's been a lot of global worry about security issues and how you balance security issues with religious freedom issues is really a very sensitive domain.
Do they have a substantial Muslim minority in Ethiopia?
Well, it's something like 17% of the population.
And is it concentrated in the south near Somalia, or?
My sense is it would have concentrated geographical pockets.
Mm-hmm.
It's undoubtedly spread through the country, but
And so
pockets.
the security and liberty concern you're talking about would be, how do you manage those populations?
Well, a practical way it can come up is that there is an initial instinct of a lot of government officials who are just coming at the issue cold, is to tighten up on registration requirements. Now, what this really does, in fact, is that the legitimate groups who are law-abiding will try to abide by a new, more difficult regime of registration, of setting up the basic legal entities that they operate with. And for a lot of religious groups, it means they just give up on operating in the country because it's too difficult. So this means the country loses the benefits of some of the legitimate social contributors. The more problematic groups don't really care about the law, so they come in anyway, and because they just ignore the registration rules, and so the intention is to give the government a tighter handle on problematic groups, but the effect is they have less and they lose some of the benefits that religious groups would normally provide. But it is true that civil society in Russia has been massively weakened over the past decade. In part, what happened was, in the aftermath of 9/11, there were a lot of UN resolutions calling for people to have tightened security measures and so forth, and Russia took advantage of those to firm up a lot of security rules. They were also very conscious of the Orange Revolution in neighboring Ukraine, so we started to get a lot of rules that really tighten up on the ability of foreign organizations to help fund civil society organizations. I think there had been a tremendous amount of interest and support coming from the US, coming from the EU, to support various kinds of civil society initiatives, and those have been made much more difficult because it's very difficult to transfer funding into Russia. Whether Russia is in some ways more homogeneous. Just we've witnessed Turkey is complicated. Turkey is very important. Turkey tends to be very defensive, it was interesting having this person from Turkey here this year. I mean, so defensive that sometimes he didn't. And his first intervention, one of the speakers from Norway, whom I've known for years and who is a great defender of Islam, interpreted what he said as an attack on Islam in Turkey, which part of it was a translation problem. He just, I think, hadn't understood, but part of it is a kind of defensiveness. I think one of the things that Turkey is going through is they have had this tradition of Kemalist secularism, which is it's been very harsh kind of secularism, banning headscarves in the universities and so forth. And yet they now have the leading party is essentially a more religiously oriented party. And this makes the secularists very nervous. I'm not sure. There are differences between a Muslim religiously oriented party and a Christian religiously oriented party, but there are a lot of analogies between the Turkish party and sort of the Christian right in the U.S. I'm sure I'd be criticized for saying that, but there are similarities. I think one of the theories behind the International Religious Freedom Act is that religious freedom is a very fundamental human right, but in typical State Department or Foreign Office settings, there's the following problem. For the most part, officials in foreign ministries or in the State Department have a lot of things that are assigned to them. And so whoever has religion assigned to him will probably have a lot of other human rights. And if you've got a list, what's going to be on the list is torture, disappearances, and some things like that. And frankly, those could take all your time. And so what happens with religious liberty issues, or what was happening, is that they would just kind of migrate down the list. And the difficulty with that is that it's true that on any given day, religious liberty concerns are probably less dramatic than some other pressing and urgent agenda items. But they are deep issues, and they simmer, and they have a tendency to explode if you don't deal with them. So part of the thinking, part of the original thinking that got it moving was a lot of worries about Christian persecution, because most of the religious persecution on earth is persecution of Christians. People don't realize that. One of the problems is most of the persecution is done by other Christians. So that's also a difficulty. The value of having USERF is that it does provide quite independent voice. The ambassador at large is in the State Department, and over time has tended to get buried more and more deeply in the State Department, which is a bit of a problem. But that person, the State Department has a lot of things that guide State Department policy, and religious freedom is an important factor, but it's not the only factor. And so there are pressures on that office that it's helpful to have someone standing outside saying, whatever U.S. normal policy is, these are real religious freedom concerns. So that's the independence. One of the problems for U.S. Commission is it doesn't have a very strong power base. It does have a megaphone, it can speak. Over time, I think there's been some sense among the most effective of the members of the Commission that to really have influence, it's got to use leverage from Congress.